The lobby of the Lexington Grand Hotel shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, its marble floors polished to a mirror finish, reflecting golden light on guests in tailored suits and sequined dresses. Outside New York buzzed with its usual restlessness, taxis, honking voices rising the city, refusing to sleep, but inside the air carried a different rhythm. Champagne flutes clinking, jazz music, spilling softly from a live quartet, and conversations weaving together in threads of laughter and ambition. Emma Carter stood near the bar, her hand curled tightly around a half-empty glass of whiskey she should never have ordered because she was not a whiskey drinker, not even a heavy drinker at all. But tonight was not a night for moderation. Tonight was the night everything seemed to collapse at once. Her boyfriend of 3 years had walked out earlier that evening, choosing a promotion in another city and another woman who came with it. The job she had been counting on to cover next semester's student loan payment had evaporated after budget cuts, and the hospital had called again, reminding her of the balance due for her mother's treatment, and the weight was too much. Her chest hurt from holding in tears and anger. Her friends had invited her here, promising distraction in the form of loud music and too many cocktails, and she had come dressed in a simple black dress that was elegant but understated something. She had worn for office parties in better times, and she had told herself she would smile, that she would laugh, and let them lift her mood, but the sight of other people kissing at midnight of couples, whispering promises into each other's ears, had driven her deeper into the glass in her hand. The bartender had raised his eyebrows when she asked for another, but she had waved him off with the kind of smile that said, "Do not worry about me," though her eyes were already glassy and her throat raw from crying. In the restroom 30 minutes earlier, and when her friends disappeared to the dance floor with strangers, she slipped away stumbling toward the elevators. Her heels clicked unevenly against the marble drawing glances from a few passers-by, but she kept her head down, embarrassed by her lack of composure, and the elevator ride to the 10th floor swayed around her, the numbers blinking in steady rhythm until the bell chimed. She stepped into the hallway, her purse dangling from her shoulder, her mind foggy, telling herself she just needed to reach her room, collapse on the bed, and shut out the world for a while. She fumbled with the keycard, blinking at the blurry numbers on the door, unsure if it was 1008 or 1108, but she could not remember, so she slid the card, the light flashed green, and the lock clicked open, and relief rushed through her as she pushed inside. The room was dim curtains drawn tight, the hum of the city muffled, and she kicked off her shoes and leaned against the door, exhaling shakily, only to notice that the scent of cologne hung in the air, warm and expensive, nothing like her own perfume, and she frowned, blinking into the darkness. On the bed, a figure stirred broad shoulders, shifting under white sheets, a man's silhouette catching the faint glow of the bedside lamp, and her heart leapt, her drunken mind twisting reality into hope, convincing her that it was Daniel, the boyfriend who had left her only hours ago. Her throat tightened and tears welled again as she crossed the room, words spilling out without restraint. Telling him, "You came back. I knew you could not just leave me like that. Please tell me you did not mean it." Her voice cracking raw and desperate as she sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline. The man blinked at her confusion, flickering in his gaze, but he did not push her away. Instead, he listened silent and still as she poured out her heartbreak, confessing how empty she felt, how everything seemed to collapse in a single day, how she could not bear another abandonment. Her tears falling freely, streaking her flushed cheeks, and dampening the sheets beneath her hands. In her haze, she leaned closer, her forehead brushing against his shoulder, the warmth of another human presence melting her resistance, and she whispered apologies, promises, fragments of dreams she thought had died, calling him by the wrong name, clinging to him as if she could stop time and rewrite the evening. He could have stopped her. He could have told her she was in the wrong room, that she had mistaken him for someone else. But something in her brokenness pulled at him, because he was used to boardrooms and contracts, to icy negotiations where emotions had no place yet. Here was a stranger, fragile and unguarded, showing him a truth he rarely allowed himself to witness. Her sobs slowed, replaced by silence, heavy with unspoken need, the air thickening between them charged and electric. And when she finally lifted her face, her eyes shimmering with both pain and longing, he did not turn away the distance, closing in the smallest of gestures, a brush of fingers, a tentative kiss that deepened into surrender. The night unfolded not as a plan, but as a cascade of moments they could not take back, messy and raw and imperfect, born of desperation and vulnerability. Yet somewhere in the chaos lay a strange kind of comfort, as though both had found in the other a fleeting refuge from their own battles. When she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, curled beside him, the man lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions he could not answer, wondering who she was, why she had come here, and why holding her felt like the first real thing in a long time. He did not know her name, she did not know his, but the night had carved itself into both of them, a mistake wrapped in intimacy, a secret neither had expected. The city outside never slept, but inside the suite, the world had narrowed to two, strangers who were no longer strangers, bound by silence, proximity, and the strange rhythm of vulnerability. Alexander Hayes, heir to one of the most influential investment empires in the country, and a man whose name alone could move markets, lay still for a long time, studying the woman who had stumbled into his room. He had been in New York under a veil of anonymity, staying away from his penthouse because of relentless press, choosing instead to lodge in this hotel under a false booking, desiring one rare night of peace from boardroom politics and the scrutiny that shadowed him everywhere. He had not expected, her had not expected, the trembling hands clutching his sheets or the broken voice calling him by another man's name. But when she collapsed against him, sobbing, something inside him, long frozen, had cracked. He told himself he should send her away, that this was dangerous, but he did not. He found himself responding to the ache in her voice, to the honesty that spilled out of her in fragments and apologies. As her breathing steadied against his chest, he caught the faint smell of vanilla and whiskey in her hair. And when she whispered, "Please do not leave me again," his chest tightened, because he had heard countless pleas and negotiations, but never one that sounded so unguarded, so uncalculated. He shifted slightly, meaning to create distance, but her hand caught his shirt as if on instinct, holding him there, tethering him to her storm. It was then that the spark ignited, not sudden flames but a slow burn, fed by loneliness, exhaustion, and that fragile trust born of strangers meeting at their lowest points. He tilted his head, brushing his lips against her temple, and felt her flinch, then melt as though torn between guilt and longing. When she looked at him, really looked through the haze of tears, she seemed startled not to see the man she thought he was yet. She did not pull away, perhaps too tired, perhaps too desperate to care. And in that suspended moment, he leaned in and kissed her. It was tentative testing, but when she responded with a broken whimper, it deepened a conversation, without words, both giving and taking pieces of themselves they never meant to share. Her fingers curled into his shoulders, anchoring herself, while he traced the line of her jaw as if memorizing it, the room filled with the sound of their uneven breaths. The low hum of city lights muted by thick curtains, and the heavy thud of hearts beating out of sync, yet searching for the same solace. Every gesture carried tension, each pause loaded with the question of whether to stop, whether to retreat. But neither did carried forward by something larger than reason. He pulled her closer, and her defenses fell further, until the line between mistake and choice blurred completely. It was not a polished romance, not a scene rehearsed by lovers who knew each other well. It was messy, clumsy, at moments punctuated by whispered apologies and tears that had not yet dried, but it was real, raw, and searing. He had spent years surrounded by women who knew his worth in dollar signs, who calculated every smile and every touch, and yet here was someone who had not even recognized him, who had spoken to him as if he were nothing more than a man who might leave her too. And it struck him harder than he wanted to admit. She fell asleep for a moment in his arms, then stirred, pressing closer, and each time he thought he might disentangle himself, her soft plea held him there. He let her take what comfort she needed, even as a part of him took from her as well, stealing pieces of warmth he had not allowed himself to need. When dawn's first light filtered faintly through the curtains, casting pale lines across the room, he realized he had not closed his eyes once. He studied the curve of her cheek, resting against his shoulder, the way her hand remained curled over his chest, as if afraid to let go, and he wondered again who she was, what pain had carved those words out of her, and why fate had pushed her into his path. She stirred then, blinking groggily confusion, dawning slowly, and when she saw him she froze. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Then panic flooded her face, and she scrambled upright, gathering her dress, whispering, "Oh my God," over and over. He sat up watching her, half expecting her to stay, half hoping she might at least tell him her name, but she kept shaking her head, tears welling again, as reality crashed down on her. She muttered, "I should not have, I am sorry, I should not have," and despite wanting to stop her to reassure her, he did not move. He knew that if he spoke, if he reached out, she might crumble again, and something told him she needed to flee. She grabbed her shoes, nearly tripping as she stuffed them into her bag, and without once meeting his eyes again, she bolted. The door clicked shut, and silence reclaimed the room. Alexander sat there, the sheets still warm, from where she had been staring at the closed door. On the nightstand lay a small object she had dropped in her rush, a thin silver bracelet scuffed at the edges, clearly old and precious. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm, feeling the weight of it and the questions it carried. He should have felt relieved, he told himself, relieved that the night was over, that no one had discovered his secret lapse of control. Instead, he felt restless, unsettled, as though he had been handed a puzzle without all its pieces. He closed his fist around the bracelet and exhaled slowly, He had no name, no number, no way to find her. And yet, deep down, he knew he would not be able to let this go. Somewhere in the city, she was waking too, perhaps already regretting, perhaps already convincing herself it had been nothing. But for him, it had become everything a crack in the armor he wore so carefully, a reminder that he was not as untouchable as he liked to believe. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling, and whispered into the emptiness, "I will find you." The morning sun spilled into the Lexington Grand, through tall windows, touching the city with pale strokes of light. But inside Alexander Hayes's suite, the atmosphere remained heavy, with the remnants of the night. The sheets still carried the warmth and faint perfume of the woman who had fled before dawn, leaving him restless and unmoored. He sat on the edge of the bed, the silver bracelet turning between his fingers like a riddle, his jaw tight with questions. For years he had lived a life of perfect control. Every detail of his days, managed every choice, calculated. Yet a single night had unraveled him, leaving him desperate for answers he could not grasp. Down the hallway, Emma Carter pressed her back against the closed door of her own room, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Her dress was wrinkled, her mascara smeared, and the taste of regret clung to her mouth like poison. She dropped her bag on the carpet and stumbled toward the bathroom, gripping the counter as she stared at her reflection. The girl in the mirror looked like a stranger, someone reckless, someone who had betrayed herself in the search for comfort. Tears welled up again as she whispered, "What have I done?" over and over, her voice breaking. She thought of her mother's medical bills, of the loans piling up, of the job she had just lost, and now this, a night with a stranger whose name she did not even know. Shame pressed down on her thick and suffocating, and she told herself no one would ever find out. It would be her secret, buried and locked away. If she pretended it never happened, maybe she could believe it. She showered quickly, scrubbing until her skin burned as though she could wash away, not just the night, but the grief and loneliness that had led her there. By the time she dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, she looked like an ordinary young woman, again invisible safe. She packed her bag and slipped out of the hotel, ignoring the curious glance of the concierge keeping her eyes fixed on the revolving doors that would free her from the weight of that building. Outside, the city roared back into focus, taxis swerving, street vendors shouting, horns blaring. She inhaled the cold morning air and promised herself she would never come back. Alexander, meanwhile, did not leave his room. He sat with coffee untouched, staring at the skyline as the city came alive. He told himself she had been just a stranger, an accident, nothing more. But the bracelet glimmered on the table like a challenge, its worn edges, speaking of history of value, not in money but in memory. It was not the sort of thing a woman would discard willingly. It meant something, and because it meant something, so did she. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, reminders of meetings and calls, but he ignored them uncharacteristically late. For once, his empire could wait. All he could think about was the look in her eyes before she realized the mistake. The mixture of desperation and hope, the trembling plea in her voice, when she had called him by another man's name. He clenched his jaw, angered at himself for letting her go without a word. Angered at the emptiness her absence had carved into him. Emma caught the subway back to her small apartment in Brooklyn. The rattling of the train, a cruel rhythm that echoed her thoughts. Around her, commuters scrolled their phones, sipped coffee, prepared for another ordinary day, while she sat rigid, gripping her bag, fighting the nausea rising in her stomach. She could not allow herself to break down in front of strangers. She repeated silently that it was over, that no one would know, that she could move forward. But in her chest something gnawed a whisper, reminding her of the gentleness in his silence, the steadiness of his arms when she had cried. She shook her head violently, refusing to let herself romanticize what had been a mistake. Her mother's voice on the phone later that morning steadied her, somewhat reminding her that bills still needed to be paid, that life was not pausing for her heartbreak or her shame. She promised her mother she would figure something out, that she would find another job, that everything would be fine, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. As she hung up, she pressed her forehead to the cool wall of her apartment, exhaling a shaky breath. She had no choice but to carry on. Across the city, Alexander finally rose, pulling on his suit like armor, though his mind was far from contracts and negotiations. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket and walked out, every step calculated, but every thought consumed by the mystery she had left behind. He told himself he would not chase her, that it was foolish, that he had no time for obsessions. Yet he also knew he would not be able to forget. He had seen thousands of faces shaken, thousands of hands, but hers had imprinted itself on him in a way he could not shake. For Emma, the morning became a blur of phone calls, rejected applications, and the relentless reminder of her dwindling savings. By noon, she felt the walls of her apartment closing in, the weight of responsibility crushing her chest. She clung to the idea that she had to be strong, that her mother needed her, that one night of weakness would not define her. But each time she closed her eyes, she saw him again, the stranger's eyes watching her in silence, as if he had seen her more clearly than anyone ever had. She pressed her palms to her face, whispering again and again, "No one will ever know. No one can ever know." And yet, across town, Alexander leaned against the window of his car, the silver bracelet glinting in his hand, and he whispered just as stubbornly, "I will find you." Alexander Hayes had never been a man who allowed uncertainty to linger, and yet days after the night that had unraveled his carefully constructed world, he found himself haunted by the image of the nameless woman who had stumbled into his suite. He should have dismissed it, should have filed her away as a drunken mistake. But the bracelet in his pocket told a different story, a whisper that she was not meant to be forgotten. His assistants noticed the distraction. His board grew restless when he postponed a meeting for the first time in years, but Alexander did not care. Instead, he pulled the hotel's security footage, leaning on his influence and resources. He watched frame after frame of guests coming and going, his eyes locking onto the image of her entering the wrong door, her posture slouched with exhaustion and drink, her face streaked with tears. He replayed it more times than he would admit, each time seeing more. The vulnerability in her movements, the quiet strength it must have taken to walk into a place she did not belong. He demanded to see the check-ins, but she had paid cash for her room, another twist of fate that denied him answers. Still, he would not give up. Emma, meanwhile, returned to her routine, though nothing about it felt normal anymore. She picked up extra shifts at the cafe where she worked, carrying trays of lattes and muffins to hurried customers who never met her eyes, while inside she battled the gnawing memory of that night. She told herself she was fine, that the past could be buried, that no one needed to know, but the weight of shame clung to her like a second skin. Every time she caught sight of her reflection in the cafe window, she saw the girl who had made a terrible mistake, the girl who had let loneliness push her into the arms of a stranger. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she remembered not rejection, but warmth, not cruelty, but silence that had felt strangely protective. She hated herself for thinking of him, hated the way her chest ached when she remembered his eyes. Bills piled higher on her kitchen counter, letters stamped with final notice, the hospital calling again about her mother's treatment. Emma worked until her feet ached and her back screamed, but the money never stretched far enough. One night after closing, she sat alone in the dark cafe, staring at the numbers on her phone, fighting the hopelessness threatening to swallow her. She whispered to herself that she would get through this, that she had no choice. Alexander's search widened. He sent investigators discreetly through the city, hired firms under the guise of business inquiries, every lead chasing a ghost. He told himself it was ridiculous that he was wasting time. But the thought of her walking through life burdened and unseen unsettled him. He remembered the way she had cried against him, remembered the plea not to leave her, and though he knew she had mistaken him for someone else, he could not let it end there. His world was built on acquisition, on finding what others could not, and now she had become the most important pursuit of all. Emma's world grew smaller by contrast. Between shifts, she took freelance gigs, cleaning apartments, babysitting for neighbors, anything to scrape together a few dollars. She often skipped meals to stretch her paycheck, her stomach growling as she fed her mother when she came to visit on weekends. She told her mother everything was fine, that she was managing, but late at night she lay awake in her narrow bed, tears sliding silently into her pillow, the weight of secrets pressing down harder than any debt collector. Sometimes she imagined the stranger's voice again, low and steady, though he had spoken so little, and she wondered who he was. Perhaps he was married, perhaps he was dangerous, perhaps he had already forgotten her. She told herself it was better this way, that she did not need him, that she could survive alone, and yet the hollow ache would not leave. Alexander attended charity galas and corporate dinners, but his attention was never fully present. He found himself scanning crowds, searching faces for her, even though logic told him she would never be there. His sister noticed his distraction, teased him for seeming human at last, but he brushed her off. The truth was he felt alive for the first time in years, and it terrified him. He was used to control, but this pursuit had no guarantees, no contracts to sign, no leverage to wield, except determination. Emma stumbled through each day, caught between guilt and survival, telling herself the night had been a mistake. She could bury unaware that somewhere in the city, a billionaire had made her his obsession. Their worlds spun separately, one glittering with power, the other weighed down by struggle, yet both bound by a night that had been nothing and everything. 2 weeks later, Emma found herself carrying a tray of champagne flutes through the gilded ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation's annual charity gala. The kind of event she would never have attended if not for the catering job she had begged to take on for extra cash. She wore the standard black uniform hair, pulled back expression, neutral blending into the sea of staff, weaving between tables of the city's elite. Her feet ached from hours of standing, but her mind wandered far more painfully. Thinking of her mother in the hospital, the bills waiting on her counter, the suffocating weight of responsibility. She moved quickly, avoiding eye contact with the glamorous guests draped in designer gowns, wishing only to get through the night without incident. At the same time, Alexander Hayes arrived at the gala with the effortless presence of a man who belonged to that world, his tailored suit perfect, his expression unreadable. Though inside his thoughts were far from the business donors he was expected to impress. He had attended only because his company was a major sponsor, and he considered leaving early until his eyes swept the room and froze. There she was across the glittering expanse, balancing a tray with careful grace, her face partially hidden by a strand of hair that had slipped loose. His heart lurched violently, a surge of recognition hitting him like a physical blow. After endless searching, after nights replaying the memory of her tears, she was here in the same room, utterly unaware that the man she had stumbled into was watching her now. He excused himself from a conversation, ignoring the puzzled glances of associates, and began to move through the crowd, his gaze locked on her. Emma felt it before she saw him, a strange heat prickling at the back of her neck. She turned, and when her eyes met his, she nearly dropped the tray. The world tilted, the noise of chatter and music fading into a dull roar in her ears. She recognized him instantly, the man from that night, the stranger who had held her while she wept, the mistake she had sworn to bury. Panic surged, her pulse racing. She spun quickly, heading toward the staff doors, desperate to escape, but he was faster. Alexander intercepted her near the hallway, his hand brushing her arm, firm but not rough. She froze, trembling, the tray rattling slightly. For a long moment neither spoke, the air between them charged with memory. Finally he said quietly, "You left," and Emma shook her head, whispering, "I should not be here. Please let me go." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened slightly enough to keep her still. His eyes searched hers, frustration and relief battling in his expression. "Do you even know what you did to me?" he murmured, his voice low, meant for her alone. She swallowed hard, whispering back, "It was a mistake. I was drunk. I thought you were someone else. It was nothing." Her words cut at him, but he refused to let go. "Nothing does not leave me awake for weeks. Nothing does not make me tear apart this city trying to find you." She stared, stunned, unable to comprehend that he had searched. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, torn between fear and the pull. She felt even now standing so close. She whispered again, "Please, I cannot do this," and he leaned closer, his voice rough. "You already did." The sound of footsteps in the hall broke the tension, forcing Emma to step back, cheeks burning, as another staff member passed by. She lowered her eyes, muttering an excuse, and fled toward the kitchen, leaving Alexander standing there, jaw clenched, heart pounding. He did not follow immediately, knowing he could not corner her while she was working, but he made a silent vow. She was not slipping away again. Later that night, when her shift ended, she hurried toward the service exit, only to find him waiting, leaning against a sleek black car, as if he had been carved from the shadows themselves. She froze, clutching her bag, her breath catching. He pushed off the car and stepped toward her, his gaze unwavering. "We are not done, Emma." She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes, whispering, "You do not even know me. You should forget me. Please just forget." But he shook his head slowly, his voice like steel. I cannot, and neither can you." She turned away, but his words followed her into the night, echoing louder than the city around them. Emma did everything she could to avoid him after that night at the gala, but avoidance became impossible when the catering company called her 2 days later, offering another temporary assignment, this time at a corporate dinner hosted by none other than Hayes Global. She almost said no, her throat tightening at the sound of the name, but the promise of double pay for a last-minute shift drowned her hesitation. Bills did not wait for pride, and her mother's medical treatment certainly would not. So she found herself again in black uniform, moving through the glass towers of Midtown Manhattan, with trays balanced and eyes lowered, determined to keep invisible. Yet invisibility around Alexander Hayes was an illusion. The moment he stepped into the sleek dining hall conversation, hush following him like it always did, his eyes scanned until they found her. Their gazes collided, and Emma's knees nearly buckled. She ducked quickly, disappearing into the kitchen, but Alexander had already marked her presence. All night his attention drifted his business partners, noticing, whispering, speculating, until one of them, a sharp-tongued investor, leaned over to a colleague and muttered loudly enough to carry, "Looks like Hayes has a new toy." The words stung Emma, who overheard as she passed, and she almost dropped the empty glasses she carried. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to scream. Instead, she forced herself through the shift, only to find Alexander waiting by the staff elevator as she tried to leave. He stepped in front of her, his expression stormy. "Why do you keep running?" he demanded quietly, his voice vibrating with restrained anger. She hugged her bag to her chest, whispering back, "Because I cannot be part of your world. Because your world destroys people like me." He frowned, about to respond, when a flash interrupted them. A photographer lurking near the entrance had snapped a picture, and within 24 hours, Emma's face appeared in tabloids beside headlines, speculating about the mysterious brunette seen leaving Alexander Hayes's event. Overnight, she became the subject of vicious gossip. Online commentators called her a gold digger, a waitress aiming to climb into the billionaire's bed, a nobody chasing headlines. Emma sat at her small kitchen table, reading the words on her cracked laptop, her hands shaking her chest tight. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to shut it off, but the damage was done. At the hospital, her mother saw the same headlines and asked in a trembling voice what was going on, and Emma forced a smile, insisting it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, even as her stomach knotted with fear. Meanwhile, within Hayes Global, Alexander faced his own storm. His mother, the elegant and formidable Eleanor Hayes, called him to her office, her tone sharper than usual. "I warned you," she said coldly. "You cannot let yourself be distracted. The family name cannot be dragged through scandals. Who is she?" Alexander remained silent, but his mother pressed, "Is she after your money? Do not be foolish, Alexander. You have responsibilities greater than yourself." Across the table, his sister Victoria raised an eyebrow, smirking slightly, her voice dripping with mock sympathy as she added, "She looks sweet in the pictures, but sweet girls do not end up in tabloids, do they?" Alexander shot her a glare, but the doubt his family planted gnawed at him. Was Emma using him? Was the night truly just a mistake to her? He clenched his jaw, remembering the bracelet still in his possession, the tears that had seemed too raw to be fabricated, and told himself she was not like the others, though the whisper of uncertainty lingered. Into this chaos stepped another figure, Miranda Sloane, a wealthy socialite and businesswoman who had long pursued Alexander as both business partner and potential husband. She appeared at his office unannounced, smiling with perfect poise. Carrying the tabloids in hand, "You could end all this nonsense," she purred, "by being seen with someone respectable, someone like me." Alexander dismissed her coldly, but she lingered like smoke, whispering poison in board members' ears, fueling the rumors that Alexander had lost control. For Emma, the nightmare deepened when her landlord slipped a notice under her door, threatening eviction if rent was not paid within 10 days. She stared at the paper, her hands trembling, feeling the walls of her world collapse. That evening, she found herself sitting on a park bench, head in her hands, when a man in a dark suit approached. He introduced himself as someone from Miranda's circle, his words slick and threatening. He warned her to step away from Alexander Hayes if she valued her safety, hinting at consequences for her mother's treatment if she refused. Emma's blood ran cold. She walked home shaking, terrified, clutching her phone, debating whether to call Alexander, but pride and fear held her back. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, whispering to herself that she could not drag him further into her ruin. Alexander, meanwhile, faced his own turmoil. His board questioned his judgment, his family pushed him toward alliances he did not want, and the media painted him as reckless. Yet each time he considered letting Emma go, his mind returned to her eyes that night, to the way she had whispered, "Please do not leave me again." He knew he could not abandon her. He arranged for discreet protection near her apartment, though she never knew. He followed the trails of threats back to Miranda's camp, his fury simmering. He swore that if anyone touched Emma, if anyone dared to harm her or her mother, they would face consequences far beyond rumors. The conflict escalated like a tightening rope. Emma battled humiliation and fear. Alexander fought pressure from every side, and between them stretched a fragile thread of connection neither could sever. Every meeting crackled with tension, every glance filled with both longing and doubt. He wanted to protect her, but questioned if she truly wanted him. She wanted to run, but found herself unable to erase him from her thoughts. And as whispers turned into open accusations, as enemies circled closer, they both began to realize that the night they had once called a mistake had become the center of their lives. A secret war between love and survival. Emma tried to distance herself, bury herself in work, and convince herself that Alexander Hayes was nothing but danger, wrapped in a tailored suit. Yet his presence pressed against her life like gravity, impossible to escape. After the tabloids and whispers, he reached out carefully, not with grand gestures, but with quiet persistence, sending small signs that he knew her struggle. One evening after her shift at the cafe, she returned home to find the rent notice gone from her door, replaced with an envelope that covered the balance in full, though no name was written inside. She clenched it in her hands, heart pounding, knowing instinctively it was him torn between gratitude and fury. The next day she confronted him in front of his building, cheeks flushed, voice shaking as she demanded why he kept interfering. He looked down at her with eyes steady and unreadable and simply said, "Because I can see how hard you are fighting, and because no one ever fought for me when I was drowning." The words struck her, softening the walls. She tried so hard to keep raised. Days passed, and small cracks in Alexander's armor revealed themselves to her. She saw him not only in boardrooms or on magazine covers, but in quiet moments when he allowed himself to breathe. He invited her once to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge at dawn, the city skyline glowing behind them, the air crisp his hand, brushing hers in a way that made her pulse race. She laughed for the first time in weeks, the sound surprising even herself. And he watched her with an expression she could not decipher, something like awe mixed with longing. On another evening, he drove her out of the city to a small coastal town where the ocean stretched endlessly, and they sat on the hood of his car sharing takeout burgers, watching waves crash. It was absurd, a billionaire eating fast food with a waitress. But in that moment, she felt more alive than she had in years, more seen, more human. She realized then that beneath the layers of power and control, he was a man carrying scars just as she was. He told her of betrayals in business, of a father who had demanded perfection, of a childhood where love had been measured in achievements rather than affection. She listened quietly, and when he finally fell silent, she placed her hand over his, whispering, "You do not always have to be strong." His eyes softened, and for the first time, she thought she saw the boy he once had been, vulnerable and yearning. Their bond deepened not only through words, but through unspoken glances, through the way his hand lingered at the small of her back. When they walked through the way, she found herself leaning into him when exhaustion pulled her down. At her mother's hospital bed, he appeared unexpectedly one afternoon, standing awkwardly with flowers in hand, and her mother's grateful smile lit the room in a way Emma had not seen in months. Watching him kneel by her mother's side, speaking gently, Emma felt something shift inside her, a recognition that this was no longer just a mistake or obsession, but the beginning of something that could heal wounds on both sides. Sexual tension threaded through their growing closeness like an undercurrent. Their first kiss, since the night in the hotel, happened almost by accident. Standing too close in a narrow hallway, laughter fading into silence, their eyes meeting until the inevitable pull closed the gap. It was gentle lingering, but it left them both breathless, trembling, with the knowledge of what lay just beneath the surface. Later in his penthouse, she found herself in his arms again, this time not because of drunken desperation, but because of choice, because of the undeniable connection that had grown between them. He touched her as though she were fragile glass, and she responded with a fierceness that surprised them both. Yet even as passion flared, reality intruded. She would pull back, whispering of debts and fear, and he would grow quiet, his jaw tightening as though he wished he could erase the world outside the room. Their romance became a dance of closeness and restraint, each moment of intimacy shadowed by the obstacles they could not ignore. Still, they could not stay away from each other. Emma discovered strength in his presence, the reminder that she was not entirely alone, and Alexander discovered peace in her laughter, in the gentleness she carried despite everything. They began to heal each other in small ways, building something fragile but real, though both knew storms still gathered on the horizon, storms that would test whether love could withstand the weight of power's secrets and scars. The fragile rhythm Emma and Alexander had built shattered one evening when her past crashed violently into the present. She had just finished a late shift at the cafe when she saw a familiar figure leaning against the brick wall outside. His arms crossed, his smile bitter. Daniel, the ex who had abandoned her, The man whose name she had whispered that night in the wrong hotel room now stood in front of her with cruel amusement in his eyes. "So this is how you got by," he sneered, climbing into Hayes's bed. "No wonder you stopped calling me." Emma froze her stomach, churning fury and shame colliding. She told him to leave, but he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a poisonous whisper. "The world already thinks you are his little pet. What will they think when I tell them you were with me the same night?" Her hand trembled as she pushed past him, dart pounding, but the damage was already in motion. Within days, gossip sites exploded with claims that Emma had engineered the entire scandal, that she had targeted Alexander for his money, that she was not the naive girl in the tabloids, but a manipulator who had traded one man for another. Photos surfaced of her with Daniel from years before, twisted into evidence of her supposed schemes. Headlines blared with words like gold digger and opportunist, tearing apart the fragile reputation she had left. Emma sat on the floor of her apartment, scrolling through the storm, tears sliding unchecked down her cheeks, her phone buzzing relentlessly with calls from unknown numbers, threats, and insults. She felt the walls caving in. At the same time, Alexander was summoned to an emergency board meeting, his directors waving the tabloids in front of him, demanding explanations. His mother's voice was sharp with condemnation, his sister smirking as if she had predicted this fall. Miranda Sloane reappeared smug and polished, telling him to choose wisely before the scandal destroyed not only his name, but the company itself. For the first time, Alexander hesitated. The evidence was damning, and though his heart screamed that Emma was not capable of such betrayal, his head whispered doubts. He remembered the way she had called him by another name. That first night, remembered the mystery she had wrapped herself in, remembered how little she had told him about her past. When he finally confronted her, his voice was colder than he intended, demanding to know the truth. Emma, already raw from humiliation, broke beneath his questions, her voice shaking, as she insisted she had not set him up, that she had never used him, but her words only seemed to deepen his fury at his own confusion. "You lied to me," he accused. "You hid everything." She stared at him, stricken, whispering that she had nothing to give but herself, and if that was not enough, she would walk away. The silence that followed cracked something inside both of them. She left his penthouse that night with tears burning her eyes, her chest hollow, her world collapsing again. For Alexander, the days that followed were a torment of doubt. He wanted to believe her, but the voices around him pressed harder, demanding he end it before it destroyed him. He spent sleepless nights replaying every look, every word, trying to piece together a truth he could not grasp. Emma disappeared into herself, quitting shifts, avoiding calls, burying under blankets. While the city raged around her, she told herself it was over, that she should never have let herself hope. Yet even in the deepest despair, her heart clung stubbornly to the memory of his arms, to the quiet moments when he had shown her gentleness no one else had. She whispered to herself that love was never supposed to be easy, but wondered if theirs had been doomed from the moment she stumbled into the wrong room. The twist of fate that had brought them together now threatened to tear them apart, leaving them standing on opposite sides of a chasm, carved by secrets, lies, and the merciless eyes of the world. The breaking point came when Alexander's company faced a sudden crisis, a hostile takeover attempt triggered by rivals who used the scandal as leverage to portray him as distracted and unstable. The news spread quickly across financial media. His board panicked, and whispers of his downfall filled the air. Emma, hearing of it through the cafe television and scrolling news on her cracked phone, felt her chest twist painfully. Despite her humiliation, despite the bitterness between them, she knew she could not stand by and watch him destroyed. Against every instinct telling her to stay hidden, she appeared at the press conference where investors and journalists crowded to witness Alexander defend himself. She stood at the back, trembling, then pushed her way forward when hostile voices demanded answers about her and about the chaos she had caused. In a voice raw but steady, she declared that she had not plotted anything, that she had never sought his money or power, and that if anyone was to blame for the storm, it was her poor choices in the past, not Alexander's faith in her. The room hushed, cameras flashing, as she bared her vulnerability before the world, admitting her struggles, with debt, with her mother's illness, confessing that she had stumbled into his life broken, but never with malice. For a moment, Alexander could only stare at her, stunned, the truth of her words striking deeper than any accusation. Something inside him broke open, a flood of regret and fierce protectiveness rushing in. He realized then that he had doubted the only person who had shown him uncalculated love. Pushing past the podium, he reached for her hand, his voice carrying not just to the room, but to everyone watching. "You want to know the truth," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "The only mistake was me not trusting her sooner. She is not a gold digger, she is not a scandal, she is the woman I cannot walk away from." The declaration stunned the crowd, but in Emma's chest, something long frozen began to thaw. Tears filled her eyes as he pulled her close, the cameras exploding in flashes, the world watching as he chose her openly. Afterward, in the quiet of his office, away from the storm, he held her face in his hands, whispering apologies over and over, his voice breaking, promising he would never doubt her again. She listened, her heart aching, then placed her fingers gently over his lips, telling him she only needed him to see her, to believe her, to stand with her through the storms. That night they did not speak, much more words unnecessary, as they clung to each other, two broken people, finding strength in the cracks. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted. The media, hungry for redemption arcs, painted her as the brave woman who stood by him, the ordinary girl who risked her dignity to speak truth to power. His company stabilized the board, grudgingly impressed by his bold stance. His mother remained skeptical, his sister cynical, but even they could not deny the bond that had proven itself under fire. For Alexander, the healing came in learning to let go of absolute control, to allow love to be messy and real. For Emma, it came in believing she was worthy of being loved, not for what she endured, but for who she was. Together they began to rebuild their trust, fragile, but their connection undeniable. And on a rainy night, weeks later, as thunder rolled and the city streets gleamed with wet light, Alexander pulled her into his arms in the middle of the storm, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered, "You are the only mistake I will never regret." She closed her eyes, tears mingling with the rain, and whispered back, "Then let us stop calling it a mistake." In that embrace, beneath the weight of everything they had survived, their love transformed from a night of accident into a promise of healing, imperfect and uncertain, but real. The weeks that followed turned into a crucible that tested whether love could survive the glare of public scrutiny and the resistance of powerful families. Alexander refused to retreat, appearing openly with Emma at events, holding her hand without hesitation, his voice firm when reporters hurled cruel questions about her past. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, he chose love over image, and the world noticed. His declarations split opinion, but his unshaken resolve slowly silenced even the harshest critics. Emma struggled with the attention, feeling the weight of every camera lens and every whispered judgment. But each time she faltered, Alexander was there, steady, grounding her with a hand on her back or a quiet word in her ear. His mother Eleanor remained cold, telling him bluntly that a woman with debts and scandals could never be welcomed into their family. But even she wavered the evening she saw Emma kneeling by her bedside, after a fainting spell, whispering with genuine concern, showing compassion without calculation. It was the first crack in Eleanor's icy disapproval, though she hid it behind a mask of composure. Victoria, his sister, tried one final time to sabotage Emma, leaking false documents suggesting Emma had been paid off by rivals. But Alexander confronted her publicly, cutting her influence in the company and making clear that betrayal would not be tolerated even from blood. Miranda Sloane, furious at her failure to ensnare him, made one last desperate play, inviting him to a gala and cornering him in front of the press with a proposition of marriage. But he simply took Emma's hand and declared that the only woman he intended to marry was the one beside him. The humiliation ended Miranda's campaign, though her glare promised unfinished battles. For Emma, the hardest test came when her mother's condition worsened, and she faced the terrifying possibility of losing the only parent who had always stood by her. She tried to push Alexander away, then telling him she could not ask him to shoulder her pain. But he refused to leave, spending long nights at the hospital with her, holding her while she cried, proving that love was not about perfection, but presence. The healing that unfolded between them was not the fairy tale Emma had once imagined, but something deeper, forged in fire, in mistakes, in forgiveness. Their intimacy grew not just in passion, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, in cooking breakfast together, in her tiny kitchen, in walking her mother's dog, down cracked sidewalks, in learning how to laugh again, without fear of judgment. Yet the story did not close neatly, for even as love rooted itself firmly, challenges remained. Whispers lingered in the business world. Enemies waited for another chance. And Emma herself still carried insecurities that would not vanish overnight. But when Alexander stood before a hall of reporters and shareholders, his hand firmly clasping hers, and said with calm conviction that he was building not just an empire but a life, and that life included her, Emma felt the tide turn. She saw in his eyes not pity, not obsession, but partnership, the rare kind of love that chose her every single day. Later, as they walked out of the building into the cool night air, Emma looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief and whispered, "Why me?" He smiled faintly, brushing his thumb across her cheek, and replied, "Because in a world where everything can be bought, you were the only thing that felt real." The city lights shimmered around them, the traffic roared, but in that moment the chaos quieted, leaving only the two of them bound not by mistake any more but by choice. They kissed then, not with desperation, but with certainty, sealing a chapter that had begun in drunken grief and mistaken identity, but had blossomed into a love stronger for its scars. Their future would not be easy, but it would be theirs, and that truth was more powerful than all the wealth or power that surrounded them.